How do you brace yourself for the kind of cruelty that's become routine? The rough hand, the dragging, the laughter that follows. And then feel the Alpha King's fingers tilt your face toward the light instead? In a court where traitor blood is treated like a stain that won't wash out. Therian Blackvein doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't roar. He simply leaves his throne. And somehow, that's worse. Because when power finally looks at you, really looks, it's never just to see. It's to decide what you'll be used for. He offers you a choice in front of everyone. 2 paths. No explanations. No mercy attached. And you understand it in the same instant the hall goes silent. A king's kindness is not a gift. It's a claim. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the chapter where everything unravels. Hunger wasn't a feeling anymore. It was a creature that lived inside Saren Vale, patient, methodical. Curling its claws into the hollow behind her ribs and waiting for her to slip. The royal kitchens of Rocker Vale were loud with life and rich with scent. Meat crackled over flame. Herbs bruised under knives. Bread steamed in torn cloth. Abundance moved through the air like music, warm, mouth-watering, impossible. Saren stood at the edge of it with a scouring rag and a pan that had been scraped clean twice already, dragging her fingers along the grease as if she could pull sustenance out of metal. The smell of roasted fat and rosemary hit her like a memory of a life she'd never been allowed to have. She was useful down here. Quiet hands. Quick feet. A servant who didn't talk back because talking back required energy she couldn't spare. And she was marked. Not by a collar or a brand, Rocker Vale preferred subtler punishments. But by the way the other servants stepped around her as if her shadow carried disease. By the way the overseer counted her portions with a careful, satisfied cruelty. By the nickname that followed her through the steam and clatter. Traitors get. Still hunting scraps? A girl near the prep table said, voice honeyed with disgust. She didn't bother lowering it, no one ever did. Careful, Saren. If you lick the pan too hard, you'll start believing you deserve more. A few low laughs rolled through the kitchen, small and casual. Cruelty performed the way people breathed. Saren didn't look up. Looking up invited eyes. Eyes invited games. Her knuckles tightened around the pan's rim until the metal bit into skin. Deserve. The word was almost funny. Deserving was for wolves with names that earned respect. For bloodlines that got sung about at feasts. For daughters whose mothers hadn't died screaming in the courtyard while the court watched to make sure the lesson held. Maelys Thornward, Saren's mother, had been executed as a traitor after the border uprising failed. Saren was too young to understand what treason meant, but old enough to remember the way everyone agreed it was necessary. Old enough to learn that truth wasn't something servants like her got to hold. The elders never explained what Maelys had done. They only made sure Saren carried the aftermath. Not mercy. Utility. A reminder kept alive. She didn't know yet how the court planned to use her tonight, only that by the time the hall filled with light and music, her hunger would no longer be hidden in the dark below. The kitchens erupted into purpose. Orders snapped through steam. Copper pots rang like bells. Whole sides of meat were hauled from cool stone storage and slammed onto butcher blocks, their weight loud and certain. Servants moved with the frantic joy of people preparing someone else's celebration, because celebrations meant leftovers, and leftovers meant survival for the ones who lived on the edges of noble life. Saren stayed close to the sinks. That was where they liked her, half hidden behind stacked platters, hands wet and raw, her presence easy to forget until someone needed someone to blame for a missing spoon or a smudged goblet. A tray of honey-glazed rolls went past her shoulder so close she felt the heat of them. Her stomach clenched hard enough to make her sway. She caught herself on the counter, fingers slipping on grease. Don't look. Looking made it worse. Looking made her body remember. A ladle dipped into a pot of spiced stew, and the scent made her vision blur. Hunger didn't just hurt, it lied. It whispered that one bite would fix everything. That if she could just get something warm past her teeth, she'd be able to think again, stand straighter, breathe without trembling. She swallowed, the motion thick and painful, and kept scrubbing. Someone slammed a basket onto the prep table. Faster, the head cook barked. He was a broad-shouldered old wolf with a scar that cut his brow in half, giving him a permanent look of displeasure. Saren had once mistaken it for hatred. Later, she learned hatred came with attention. The head cook did not give her attention. That was his mercy. He shoved a knife into a young servant's hand and pointed at a stack of onions. And don't you dare cry into them. I will taste it. A few nervous laughs. The kitchen leaned into the work. Saren kept her head down until a shadow fell over the sink. Alara, the same girl from earlier, stood with her arms folded and a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. Alara was pretty in a sharp way, like broken glass catching light. She had family somewhere upstairs, a connection she liked to pretend didn't matter while she used it like a blade. Ascendant moons, Alara said, as if tasting the words. Are you excited, Saren? Saren's hands didn't slow. I'm washing. Alara leaned in, voice dropping to something intimate. You know why he's coming, don't you? The king. They say he's been restless. Looking for something that belongs to him. Saren's throat tightened. Restless. Looking. Alara watched her like she wanted the reaction more than the answer. When Saren didn't give it, Alara's smile sharpened. I bet you hope he notices you, she murmured. It must be hard. Being invisible. The words landed in the exact place hunger lived. Saren's grip on the dishcloth went white-knuckled. Alara tilted her head. Or maybe you hope he doesn't. Because if he looks at you, he might remember what your mother did. Saren's hands paused for half a heartbeat. Not because the words were new. She'd heard them in 100 shapes, whispers that followed her down hallways, murmurs that slipped under doors, laughter that rose at the mention of Maylee's thorn ward like the court had shared a joke and Saren had missed the punchline. But there was something different tonight, the way Alara said it like it was a promise. Saren forced her hands to move again, slow and steady. My mother is dead. Dead is easy, Alara said. Dead is finished. But you? She looked Saren up and down with the lazy contempt of someone inspecting a stain on fabric. You're still here. Still breathing. Still taking up space in the king's house. Saren didn't answer. Answers gave people something to hold. Alara pushed away from the sink with a soft laugh and vanished back into the bustle. Saren kept washing until her arms shook. When she closed her eyes, she could see the courtyard. She didn't remember all of it, the mind protected itself sometimes, like an animal curling around its wounded belly, but the parts she did remember were too sharp to soften. Stone under her bare feet. Snow melting into mud. The circle of guards with spears angled inward like teeth. And her mother, kneeling. Maylis Thornward's hair had been loose, dark against the pale morning. Saren remembered the way it clung to her neck as the wind pulled at it. She remembered the way Maylis's shoulders had stayed straight even as the crowd shouted for her blood. Not because she wasn't afraid, Saren could see fear, now, in hindsight, but because pride had been all Maylis had left. Someone had called Maylis a traitor. Someone else had said, loud enough for the whole court to hear, that the pack had to be purified. Saren didn't remember the blade. She remembered the sound after. The way the world had seemed to pause, stunned that it had actually happened. Then the cheers, rising like a wave, washing the moment clean. And the elder's voice near Saren's ear, watch. Remember. This is what happens when blood turns against blood. Saren opened her eyes to steam and clanging copper, her chest tight like she'd been running. A hand touched her shoulder. She flinched, hard. It was the head cook. For a second, his eyes held hers. Not unkind. Not gentle either. Just, tired, as if he'd spent too many years watching the court sharpen its cruelty into tradition. He shoved something into her palm. A crust of bread. Dense, slightly stale. Still bread. Saren stared at it, stunned. Eat, he muttered without looking at her. Not here. If they see, they'll make a game of it. Her fingers curled around the crust like it might vanish. Why, she whispered. The head cook's jaw tightened. He leaned closer, voice low enough that the steam swallowed it. Because tonight you'll need to stand, he said. And hunger makes you fall. Before Saren could respond, he was gone, barking orders again, as if he hadn't just committed a small act of treason. Saren slid behind a stack of sacks and ate the bread in 3 careful bites, forcing herself to chew slowly, forcing herself not to cry at the taste of something plain and real. It didn't fix her. It didn't fill the hollow. But it gave her a thin line of strength, just enough to keep her legs from folding when the kitchen suddenly went quiet. Not silent. Quiet in the way a pack went quiet when a predator entered the den. The service doors swung open, and the steward of the lower hall stepped inside. His robes were dark, his hands clean, his expression carved from stone. He never came down here unless someone upstairs wanted something done without noise. His gaze swept over the kitchen and landed, like a blade choosing a target, on Saren. Her stomach dropped. Not hunger this time. Something colder. The head cook stepped forward. What is it? The steward ignored him. Saren Vale. Hearing her full name from that mouth made her skin prickle. Saren wiped her hands on her apron, though the damp remained. Yes. You are summoned, the steward said. The great hall requires wine service. The kitchen breathed. Not relief. Not sympathy. Something like anticipation, sharp and bright. Saren felt every eye in the room find her at once, as if she had suddenly become visible against her will. Alara's smile appeared from the crowd like a candle flame. Saren's mouth went dry. Wine service is usually assigned, the steward finished flatly. Yes. This is a specific request. Specific. That word carried the weight of intent. The head cook's hand tightened on the edge of the prep table. She's a servant, the steward cut in. And servants are used. Saren's throat constricted. She nodded once, because what else was there? The steward turned and walked out, not waiting to see if she followed. For a moment, Saren stood frozen, bread heavy in her belly like a secret. Then the kitchen moved around her again, quieter now, as if sound itself might draw the wrong kind of attention. Someone brushed past her shoulder and murmured, "Bad luck," but it didn't sound like pity. It sounded like relief it wasn't them. Alara came closer, practically purring. "Look at that," she said. "The traitors get us going upstairs. Try not to embarrass us." Saren swallowed. "You're coming too." Alara laughed softly. "Oh, I'll be there. But we're not the same kind of entertainment, are we?" Saren didn't answer. She went to the back where the servants kept spare uniforms. Most were threadbare. Many didn't fit. Everything smelled faintly of old sweat and soap that couldn't quite erase the past. A laundress tossed her a folded set of gray livery without meeting her eyes. Saren changed behind a curtain and tried to smooth the fabric over her ribs. The cloth hung loose in places and pulled tight in others. Her body had been reduced to angles. She washed her face at a basin, scrubbing until her cheeks stung. Dirt lifted, but nothing could lift the hollowness from her eyes. As she tied her hair back, her fingers trembled. Not from weakness. From understanding. This wasn't service. This was theater. They were bringing her up so they could see the hunger on her skin against the glow of gold and meat and laughter. So the court could congratulate itself on order and obedience while watching what happened to a traitor's blood when it tried to stand among wolves who had never known deprivation. Saren stepped into the corridor outside the kitchens. The stone was colder here, the air cleaner. The scent of spices faded, replaced by something sharper, polished wood, burning oil, the faint bite of perfume drifting down from the upper levels. She followed the steward at a distance, her footsteps quiet on the worn path servants traveled. As she climbed, the sounds changed. Down below, clatter, shouting, survival. Up here, music. A low, steady pulse of drums. The bright sting of strings. Laughter that spilled freely because no one was counting the cost of it. The corridor widened. Tapestries lined the walls, wolves in battle, wolves crowned, wolves triumphant. History told from the perspective of those who survived long enough to write it. Saren's hands curled into fists at her sides. She caught her reflection briefly in a polished shield hung as decoration, a pale face, hair pulled tight, livery too large, eyes too old for the rest of her. A ghost dressed in servant gray. At the top of the final stairs, the steward paused. He didn't look at her, but he spoke like he could feel her fear. "Keep your eyes lowered," he said. "Speak only when spoken to. Do not stumble. Do not draw attention." Saren almost laughed. Attention was the point. The steward pushed open a side door. Warmth poured out, thick with scent and sound. Light spilled across the threshold like liquid gold. Beyond it was the great hall. Tables stretched long under chandeliers that blazed with oil fire, casting the room in amber. Platters overflowed. Goblets flashed. Noble wolves in velvet and fur laughed as if the world had never known hunger. At the far end, raised above all of them, sat the throne. And on it, Saren's breath caught. Alpha King Therian Blackvein wasn't a myth in flesh. He was a presence that made the room subtly tilt toward him, even when he did nothing at all. Dark hair, sharp features, a stillness that didn't read as calm so much as contained force. He wore no smile. He didn't need one. The court moved around him like water around stone. Saren's palms dampened. The steward placed a heavy silver decanter into her hands. It was warm from the kitchen, the wine inside smelling rich and sweet. The weight of it pulled at her already thin strength. "Go," the steward murmured. Saren stepped forward. Her foot crossed the threshold, leaving the shadows of the servant corridors behind. And the moment she entered the light, she felt it, the collective shift. The subtle hush that wasn't silence, but recognition. Eyes slid toward her like blades catching shine. Some mouths curved in amusement. Someone whispered, just loud enough to be heard, "They brought her up." Saren kept walking, because stopping would mean collapsing and collapsing would mean giving them exactly what they wanted. But hunger was inside her, awake now, smelling the feast, clawing at the thin crust of bread she'd stolen, demanding more. Her vision sharpened too bright at the edges. The music seemed distant and too loud at the same time. The decanter's weight grew heavier with each step. She approached the first table, head bowed, hands steady by force of will, and poured wine for a noble who didn't even look at her, only extended his cup like she was a spout, not a person. Saren's stomach twisted hard. Not at the smell. At the certainty. Because she understood now, with crystal clarity, what the Feast of Ascendant Moons truly was, for her. A celebration of dominance. And a reminder, displayed in servant gray, that the court could starve a girl for her mother's sins and call it justice. Saren lifted the decanter toward the next goblet. Her fingers trembled. Her knees softened. And somewhere above the music and laughter, the hunger inside her bared its teeth, patient and sure. Because the hall was full of light. And she had nowhere left to hide. The hunger inside her bared its teeth, patient and sure. Because the hall was full of light. And she had nowhere left to hide. Saren poured again. And again. Goblets lifted toward her without faces attached. Perfumed hands angled cups like commands. Rings flashed, gold and obsidian and sigils carved into metal, markers of bloodlines that had never had to earn their next meal. The great hall glittered with excess. Platters sagged beneath roasted boar glazed in honey and spices, birds stuffed with fruit and nuts, wheels of cheese cut open like soft treasure. Bread was torn and discarded with casual waste. Wine spilled onto polished stone and no one flinched, because nothing here was counted the way it was counted below. Laughter rolled over the tables in waves, thick and warm. It wasn't joy. Not truly. It was a kind of victory chant, proof that life was abundant for the ones seated high enough to be served. Above them, banners hung heavy in red and black, the crest of rock or veil stitched in thread that caught the firelight. Wolves in velvet and fur leaned back in their chairs, full mouths speaking through bites, eyes half-lidded with comfort. They watched the servants move like they watched the musicians, part of the evening's rhythm, not meant to be noticed unless something went wrong. Saren kept her eyes lowered. That was the rule. But her body was betraying her. Every scent was a hook. Every tray that passed was a blade dragged too close to open skin. The bread she'd eaten down in the kitchens was gone already, burned up by the climb, by fear, by the way hunger always demanded interest. Her hands trembled, just slightly, as she refilled another cup. A nobleman finally looked at her. Not at her face. At the hollow at her collarbone, the way the livery hung loose over ribs. His mouth curved. "They're not even trying to hide it," he said to the woman beside him, loud enough for Saren to hear. "Look at her. Skin and shame." The woman laughed into her sleeve. Tradition, she replied, as if the word explained everything. Saren swallowed. Her throat felt too small. She moved on, careful steps, careful breathing, careful, careful. A goblet clinked against the decanter as she poured, the sound sharp enough to make her flinch. The noble whose cup it was tilted his head, amused. "What's wrong?" he asked, smiling. "Afraid you'll spill and earn a beating?" Saren didn't answer. Silence was safer. His smile widened. "Oh, she's trained. Look at that. A traitors get with manners." The words hit like thrown stones. Saren kept moving, because stopping meant the room would notice her too clearly. Stopping meant the hunger would win sooner. But the hall was made for winning. Everything about it was dominance performed as beauty. The musicians played on the dais, the notes bright and sharp, like the court had turned conquest into music. At the center of it all, on his raised throne, Alpha King Therion Blackvein watched the room with still eyes, unreadable, his posture relaxed in the way only a predator could be relaxed. He was not laughing. He wasn't speaking much either. Those near him leaned in to catch his words, hungry for them in a different way. Saren tried not to look. Looking at a king was an invitation. She poured wine for a pair of young nobles with braided hair and matching silver cuffs. One of them leaned forward, sniffed the air, and wrinkled her nose. "Do you smell that?" she asked her companion. "Kitchen," the other said, making a face. "Poor thing. She dragged the underworld up with her." They laughed. Saren's ears burned. Her palms were slick with sweat against the metal decanter. She shifted her grip, but the thing felt heavier with every step, as if the wine inside it had turned to stone. Her vision started to tighten at the edges. Not yet, she told herself. Not here. Not in front of them. She focused on small things, the pattern in the floor tiles, the steady beat of the drums, the count of her breaths. In for 4, out for 4, as if she could control her body by ordering it. A servant passed her carrying a tray of roasted figs. The heat of them hit Saren's face like a lover's palm. Her stomach lurched so violently her knees nearly buckled. She steadied herself on nothing. The room swam. Sound became thick, as if the laughter had turned into water and she was sinking under it. The music warped, notes bending, stretching, snapping back too sharp. Saren blinked hard. The hall didn't sharpen. It blurred more. Her fingers tightened around the decanter until her knuckles ached. The metal cut into skin. The pain was real. The pain was grounding. She took one more step. Then another. Then. The world tilted. Not subtly. Not like the hall leaning toward the throne. This was violent. Sudden. Her stomach clenched, empty and furious, and heat rushed up her spine like a wave. The bright lights overhead flared, swallowing the banners, swallowing the faces. Saren tried to breathe. Air wouldn't fill. Her hearing narrowed to one brutal sound, her own pulse, pounding like a fist in her ears. She knew what was happening. She'd seen it before in the kitchens, in the servants who worked too long without food. The stagger. The sway. The collapse. The body's quiet mutiny. No, she thought. Not here. Not. Her foot caught on the edge of a rug. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe her legs simply stopped obeying. The decanter slipped in her hands. Wine arced through the air, dark and glittering in the firelight like spilled blood. A gasp rose from somewhere. Then laughter. Saren went down. Stone met her knees first, a sharp crack of pain that barely registered. Her hands hit next, palms stinging. The decanter struck the floor with a heavy clang, rolling away. Wine pooled fast, spreading like ink. Her vision tunneled. All she could see was the shine of boots around her, the hem of velvet, the swing of jeweled fabric. Above her, the laughter swelled. "Did you see that?" someone cackled. She fainted like a doe. "From what?" another voice mocked. "The smell of food?" "She's performing," a woman purred. "Look at her. Poor little ghost." Saren's cheek pressed against cold stone. The floor smelled faintly of wine and polish. She tried to push up. Her arms shook. Failed. Her stomach cramped hard enough to steal her breath. Black spots danced behind her eyes. "Keep moving," she begged herself. "Stand. Crawl. Anything." But her body was a cage that had decided to lock. A shadow fell over her. A guard. Saren recognized the boots before she saw the rest, thick leather, iron buckles, the kind worn by men who enforced order with their fists. She'd been dragged before. She'd learned the rhythm, laughter, then removal, then punishment in a place where no one watched. This was the moment. The kick. She braced for it, curling inward, protecting her ribs with her arms, tightening her jaw so she wouldn't make a sound. Pain was inevitable. Better to meet it without giving them the satisfaction of a cry. The guard's foot shifted. Saren flinched. Then. Nothing. Not the impact she expected. Not the jolt of a boot. Just a pause. The laughter faltered, confused, like a song losing its beat. A different sound cut through the hall, the scrape of wood against stone. Someone had stood. The air changed. It wasn't silence yet, but it began in pockets, spreading outward like frost. Saren's blurred gaze lifted just enough to see heads turning. Bodies angling. Faces tightening in sudden caution. The guard stepped back, not out of mercy, but out of instinct. Because the movement had come from above. From the throne. Alpha King Therian Blackvein descended the steps. He didn't hurry. He didn't rage. He moved with the measured certainty of someone who never doubted the right to cross any room he wished. Each step landed with quiet finality. The hall seemed to shrink around him, the laughter dying like candles snuffed one by one. Saren couldn't breathe properly. Her heart hammered, not from collapse now, but from the impossible sight of him leaving the dais. Kings did not descend. Alphas did not bend. Therian reached her. And then he did the thing that rewrote the hall. He knelt. The stone caught the hem of his dark robe. His knee touched the floor that had just pressed into Saren's cheek. The proximity was unreal, like a storm choosing to settle beside a single blade of grass. Saren's vision swam, but she felt it, the collective shock, the sharp inhale of 100 mouths, the stunned stillness that fell like a command. Therian's hand lifted. Saren instinctively recoiled, weakly, expecting a grip, a jerk, a display of dominance. Instead, his fingers brushed her cheek. Careful. Measured. Warm against skin gone cold. He tilted her face just enough to see her eyes. For a heartbeat, his gaze held hers. Not kind. Not cruel. Something worse. Attention. Saren's stomach turned, not from hunger this time, but from the raw vulnerability of being seen by someone who could decide her fate with a single word. Behind him, someone whispered, horrified, "Your Majesty." Therion didn't look back. His eyes stayed on Saren. Then his voice cut through the hall, low, calm, and absolute. Silence. The word wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It landed like a chain locking. The remaining snickers died instantly. Even the musicians stopped, their last note hanging in the air like a held breath. Therion's thumb rested briefly at Saren's jaw, as if confirming she was real. Saren's lips parted, but no sound came. She didn't know what to say. She didn't even know what she was allowed to say. He spoke again, not to her, but to the room. "So this is how you celebrate unity," he said. His tone was quiet enough to make everyone lean in, desperate to catch it. "With spectacle." No one answered. No one dared. He shifted his gaze up, slow, taking in the nobles nearest, the guard, the steward standing rigid by the side door, the servants frozen mid-step. Then his eyes returned to Saren. "What is your name?" he asked. Saren's throat worked. Her tongue felt thick. She forced the words out. "Saren. Vale." A flicker, something like recognition or calculation, moved behind his eyes. "Saren Vale," he repeated, and hearing her name spoken from the throne's mouth made the room feel even colder. He didn't say traitors get. He didn't say undeserving. He didn't absolve her. He simply named her. And in doing so, he made her impossible to dismiss. Therion's hand withdrew. He rose smoothly, the movement controlled, and extended his gaze to the court again. "Look at her," he said. Saren's blood turned to ice. She didn't want their eyes. She didn't want their attention. But the king's command made it law. Faces turned fully now. No longer amused. No longer careless. They studied her the way wolves studied a scent that didn't belong. Therion's voice softened, but the softness was sharp. "This is what you have allowed," he said. "This is what you have called order." A nobleman near the front, older, thick-necked, with a jeweled pin at his throat, cleared his voice as if trying to reclaim control. "Your Majesty," he began, carefully, she is the daughter of—" "I know who she is," Therion interrupted. The nobleman's mouth snapped shut. Therion looked down at Saren again. She was still on the floor. Still trembling. Still fighting to pull air into lungs that refused to fill properly. Her hands were stained with spilled wine, fingers shaking like a fawn's legs. And the king was looking at her as if she mattered enough to be a problem. He crouched slightly, less than a kneel, but enough to bring his voice closer without bringing his body down again. "You have lived in the kitchens," he said, and it wasn't a question. Saren nodded faintly. "Hungry," he added. Her throat tightened. She couldn't speak. She didn't trust her voice not to break. Therion straightened. Then he did something even more destabilizing than touching her. He offered her agency. Not in private. Not as pity. In front of everyone. "You will be given a choice," he said, and his gaze cut across the hall as if daring anyone to object. Saren's heartbeat stuttered. Choice. The word sounded like a trick. Therion looked down at her again, expression unreadable. "You may return to the kitchens," he said. Return to invisibility. Return to hunger. And you will remain what they have made you, an example. The hall stayed deathly quiet. Saren's skin prickled. Her stomach clenched. Because he wasn't threatening her with new cruelty, he was naming the cruelty that had always been there. Then Therion continued. Or, his pause was deliberate, a blade held poised. You may come under my protection. A ripple went through the room, tiny and shocked. Someone inhaled too sharply. Another noble's chair creaked as they shifted. Protection. Saren's mind raced, frantic despite her weakness. Protection meant food. Warmth. Safety from being kicked, dragged, mocked. But it also meant ownership. It meant being moved from one cage to another, only cleaner. It meant being seen every day, watched, evaluated, used. Therion's eyes held hers again, steady as iron. I will not explain the terms in this moment, he said, as if he knew the question forming in her mind. You will not be comforted with lies. A chill ran through Saren. Honesty from power was not mercy. It was precision. Understand this, Therion said, voice low enough that it felt meant for her alone, yet the whole hall heard it. Either choice changes your life. One keeps you small. One makes you visible. Visible. Saren's stomach turned again. Visible had always been dangerous. Because when the court noticed you, it didn't mean you were safe. It meant you were useful. She tried to push herself up again, and this time her elbow held for a second. Her body shook, but she managed to lift her head enough to look at him properly. The room watched her like it watched a knife's edge. Saren swallowed, tasting wine on the air, bitterness on her tongue. She wanted to scream that this wasn't fair. But fairness was a word for stories told to children who still believed adults protected them. Saren didn't believe in protection. She believed in consequences. And Therion Blackvine's attention was a consequence she hadn't earned, hadn't asked for, and didn't know how to survive. Her voice came out ragged. It scraped her throat like gravel. Therion waited. Patient. As if he had all the time in the world, because he did. Saren's eyes flicked to the nobles. Their faces were tight, offended, wary, like they'd just watched their world's rules bend and didn't know if they would snap back. The guard stood stiff and uncertain, no longer sure whether he was allowed to touch her. Alara was somewhere in the crowd, her expression unreadable now, her earlier amusement gone. Saren felt something shift inside her. Not gratitude. Not relief. A cold awareness settling into place like armor. This wasn't rescue. This was escalation. If she returned to the kitchens, she would starve quietly until one night she didn't get up again, and the court would call it tradition. If she accepted the king's protection, she would stop starving. And start being watched. A different kind of hunger would find her then. Political hunger. Faction hunger. The hunger of wolves who wanted what the king wanted. Saren's breath hitched. Her body trembled. Her mind, strangely, became clear. He had offered her a choice without clarity. That was control dressed as respect. Saren didn't have enough strength to stand, but she had enough to understand the trap. Her lips parted again, but before she could force an answer, Therion turned slightly, his gaze slicing to the steward. Take her, he ordered. Saren's blood ran cold. Not help her. Not save her. Take. Two guards stepped forward, different ones than the first. Their posture was careful now, as if she might be made of glass because the king had touched her. One bent down, hesitated, then slid an arm under her shoulders. Another lifted her legs. Saren's body went weightless, the hall spinning as she was raised off the floor. She should have felt relief. Instead, fear crawled up her spine. Because she wasn't being carried away like a servant who had inconvenienced the feast. She was being removed like a piece from a board. Claimed. Unresolved. Tharian's voice followed her as she was lifted, calm as a closing door. "Do not let her eat until I say so," he told the steward. The words punched the air out of Saren's lungs. Not even food was freely given. Not even now. The choice was real, yes, but the leash was already visible. Saren's vision blurred again as the guards carried her toward the side door, past rows of stunned nobles, past spilled wine that glimmered on stone like dark truth. She caught one last glimpse of Tharian Blackvein standing where he had knelt, his expression unreadable, the throne behind him like a shadow he could return to whenever he wished. The hall remained silent. Not because they cared. Because the king had changed the rules, and everyone was waiting to see what the new rules would cost. Saren's eyes fluttered. Her last coherent thought was sharp as a needle. If he could command her hunger, then he could command everything. And that meant the worst part wasn't collapsing. It was what came after. When the doors closed behind her and the feast's warmth vanished, Saren understood the truth that settled like iron in her bones. Being noticed was not safety. It was the beginning of the hunt. Being noticed was not safety. It was the beginning of the hunt. Saren drifted in and out of darkness as the guards carried her through corridors that smelled of wax and cold stone. The feast's warmth faded behind her like a lie, replaced by the clean, sterile chill of the upper halls, quiet here, controlled, as if the castle itself held its breath around the king's will. Her stomach twisted at the memory of Tharian's order. "Do not let her eat until I say so." Even now. Even after he had knelt. The hunger inside her didn't calm. It sharpened. It learned. It told her this was not rescue. This was restraint. They set her down in a room she'd never been allowed to enter. Not a cell. Not a servant's cot crammed beside laundry sacks. A real chamber, stone walls hung with a single tapestry, a hearth laid but unlit, a bed dressed in clean linen that smelled like sun-dried cloth instead of sweat. There was a wash basin with fresh water. There was a small table with a covered tray. The smell under that cover made Saren's mouth flood with saliva so fast it hurt. Her hands shook. A maid, young, eyes downcast, hovered near the door with the posture of someone terrified to do the wrong thing. 2 guards stood outside, visible through the crack, their silhouettes an unspoken threat. Saren sat on the edge of the bed because her legs could not trust themselves. The linens dipped under her weight, soft in a way that felt obscene. The maid cleared her throat softly. "My lady." Saren's head snapped up. The maid flinched and corrected quickly, voice smaller. "Saren. I was told to attend you." Attend. Not help. Not care. Attend like a function. Saren looked at the tray again. "What's under there?" The maid's gaze flicked toward the door. Fear flashed across her face like a shadow. "Food," she whispered. "Broth and bread. A bit of dried fruit. But I was told not to uncover it unless." Unless the king says, Saren finished. The maid swallowed. Yes. Saren's stomach clenched so hard she had to bend forward. For a moment, the room tilted, and the hunger roared in her ears. Her fingers curled into her palm, nails biting skin. She forced herself to sit upright. The maid shifted from foot to foot, helpless. Water, she offered, reaching for the basin pitcher. Saren nodded once. Water was allowed. Water didn't count as mercy. She drank slowly, the cold sliding down her throat, soothing and cruel at the same time. The hunger didn't ease. It only made more space. When she lowered the cup, she realized the maid was staring at her, not with contempt like the kitchen's, but with something worse. Reverence. Fear. Like Saren had become dangerous by proximity to the throne. Saren's voice came out rough. What are they saying? The maid blinked. Saren, I shouldn't. They're saying something, Saren pressed, and surprised herself with the steel in her tone. Hunger had stripped her down to essentials, and essentials did not include patience. The maid's lips parted, then closed. She glanced again toward the guards as if the walls might report her. Finally, she whispered, they say the king knelt. Saren's stomach rolled. As if you, the maid swallowed hard. As if you made him. Saren let out a soft, humorless breath. I didn't. The maid shook her head quickly. No, of course not. But people are angry. Confused. The high houses, her eyes widened, then she stopped herself like she'd stepped too close to a cliff. Saren leaned back against the cold stone wall beside the bed. The room felt too open. Too exposed. In the kitchens, she had shadows. Here, everything was visible. Including her. Who sent you? Saren asked. The maid hesitated. The steward. Not the king. No, the word was almost a relief. Saren stared at the covered tray again. Food inches away. An ocean away. Her hands trembled, then steadied as she folded them in her lap. This was the cost of attention, you were never alone with your own needs. Outside the door, footsteps passed. Voices murmured. Not loud enough to make out words, but the tone carried through, outrage wrapped in politeness. Controlled fury. The kind nobles used when they wanted blood without staining their sleeves. Saren closed her eyes. She saw the great hall again, the spilled wine like a dark stain, the laughter turning sharp, the way Tharian's hand had warmed her cheek like a brand. Then she heard his voice in her memory. Either choice changes your life. Saren's throat tightened. He had offered 2 paths in front of everyone, and then he had removed her before she could choose. Because the choice was not meant to be hers alone. It was meant to be witnessed. A declaration. A disruption. A new piece introduced to the board. Hours passed, or minutes. Time warped when hunger lived in your bones. Saren dozed in brief, shallow drops, always waking to the smell of food under the cover, always waking to the knowledge that it was not hers until a king permitted it. The maid remained in the corner like a trapped bird. She didn't speak unless Saren spoke first. She didn't sit. She didn't eat. She watched the door more than she watched Saren, as if expecting it to burst open with consequences. When the latch finally clicked, Saren jolted awake, heart punching hard. The guards outside straightened, boots shifting in unison. The maid bowed so quickly she nearly stumbled. Alpha King Therian Blackvein entered without announcement. He was alone. That alone was its own statement. He closed the door behind him with a quiet finality, cutting off the corridor's noise. For a heartbeat, the room felt smaller, as if the walls leaned in to listen. Therian's gaze swept over Saren, her stiff posture, the shadows beneath her eyes, the way her hands stayed folded like restraints. Then his eyes moved to the covered tray. "You have not eaten," he said. It wasn't a question. Saren kept her chin level. "You ordered it." A flicker crossed his face, approval, perhaps, or irritation that she dared remind him. "I did," he agreed. He stepped closer, stopping beside the table. He didn't touch the cover yet. "Do you know why?" Saren's stomach twisted. "To prove you can." Therian's mouth curved faintly, almost a smile, but too thin to be warmth. "Yes," he said softly. "And because if I am to change your position, I must change it publicly and completely." Saren's nails dug into her palm again. Position. A word for furniture. A word for pieces. Therian met her eyes. "You collapsed in my hall." "I was starved in your hall," Saren snapped before she could stop herself. The silence that followed was heavy. The maid looked like she might faint. Therian didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. But the air sharpened around him, the way a storm sharpened before lightning. Then he said, calmly, "Yes." The single word stole Saren's breath. He didn't deny it. He didn't soften it. He owned it. Therian lifted the tray cover. Steam rose. The scent hit Saren like a blow: rich broth, salt, slow-cooked meat, warm bread. Her body surged toward it instinctively, an animal reaching for survival. She forced herself to stay still. Therian ladled broth into a bowl with measured movements. He tore bread into pieces. He set it down in front of her like an offering that was also a test. "Eat," he said. Saren stared at the bowl. Her hand shook as she reached for the spoon. She hated that they shook. Hated that her body revealed needs so openly. Therian watched her with the same still attention he'd given her in the great hall. Surveillance disguised as concern. Saren lifted the spoon to her lips and took a small sip. Heat spread across her tongue, down her throat, into her chest. Her eyes stung, not from emotion, she told herself, but from the shock of warmth entering a body that had known only emptiness. She took another sip, slower, deliberate. Therian remained silent until her shaking eased just enough that she could control the spoon. Then he spoke, voice low. "You want to know why I intervened," he said. Saren didn't look up. "Yes." He leaned slightly against the stone mantel by the unlit hearth, posture relaxed in a way that was calculated. He wanted to appear unthreatening. He wanted her to speak freely. Saren sipped again and refused the trap by staying quiet. Therian's eyes narrowed a fraction, then he continued. "Your mother's execution stabilized this court," he said, as if discussing the weather. "There was unrest after the border uprising. Factions forming. Doubt spreading. We needed a single, undeniable consequence to remind every house what treason buys." Saren's grip tightened on the spoon until her knuckles went white. Therian didn't stop. "Maylis Thornward became that consequence," he said. "Public. Final. Unarguable." Saren's stomach churned, broth turning heavy. And me? A pause. Then, without flinching, you were the echo. Saren's breath hitched. Tharian's gaze held hers now, direct. Keeping you alive maintained the narrative, he said. A traitor's blood allowed to exist only by the court's mercy. A reminder that forgiveness is a privilege granted by power. Saren's throat tightened around a bitter laugh. Mercy. Tharian's eyes didn't soften. Leaving you in the kitchens was convenient, he admitted. You were invisible. Useful as a warning. Too weak to be a threat. The honesty was a blade, clean and sharp. Saren felt something inside her go quiet, not in peace, but in clarity. She had spent years wondering if her suffering was a mistake, a forgotten cruelty carried out by petty servants. It wasn't petty. It was policy. Tharian watched her absorb it, then added, "Tonight, you made that policy visible." "I didn't," Saren said hoarsely. "I collapsed." "You collapsed in front of the high houses," Tharian corrected. "On ascendant moons, of all nights. When every faction is watching me for weakness and watching each other for advantage." He stepped forward, voice lowering. And they laughed. Saren's spoon trembled. Tharian's jaw tightened. "They laughed in my hall," he repeated. "At the court's own weapon, turned too blunt to hide. That laughter was not about you. It was a challenge." Saren's eyes lifted to his. "A challenge to you." "Yes." The word landed like a stone. Tharian straightened, the room bending subtly to his presence again. "If I allowed you to be dragged away," he said, "I would be allowing the high houses to decide how my symbols are used. I would be allowing them to make cruelty look like my weakness." Saren swallowed hard. "So you knelt, for politics." Tharian didn't deny it. "For control," he corrected. "For order. Not for me." A beat. Then he said, very quietly, "Not only for you." Saren's chest tightened, suspicious of any softness. "What does that mean?" "It means," Tharian said, "that the court believes it owns the right to define what you are. Tonight, I reminded them that I own that right." Saren felt cold spread beneath her skin. Not comfort. Ownership. "And what am I now?" she asked. Tharian's gaze flicked to the door, as if he could see the listening world beyond it. "Now you are visible," he said. "And visibility cannot be undone." Saren looked down at the bowl. Her hunger was quieter now, soothed but not gone. It never truly left. Hunger lived in memory. She took another bite of bread, slow and deliberate. Chewed. Swallowed. Then she asked, "What are the terms?" Tharian's eyes sharpened. "You are direct." "I'm hungry," Saren replied. "It burns away the useless parts." A faint, almost imperceptible curve at the edge of his mouth. Approval again. "Or interest." "The terms are simple," he said. "You will not return to the kitchens." Saren's shoulders loosened by a fraction before she stopped herself. Relief was dangerous. "You will remain in the upper halls," Tharian continued. "You will be seen. You will attend court when summoned. You will speak when asked. You will not disappear when it becomes inconvenient for others." Saren's stomach tightened. "A display." "A presence," Tharian corrected. "There is a difference." Saren's eyes narrowed. "And what do you want in return?" Tharian's gaze held hers, unblinking. Silence, he said. About certain truths. Questions you are not yet allowed to ask. Saren's blood chilled. About my mother. Tharian didn't answer directly. That was answer enough. He added, and you will understand that protection is not affection. You will be watched. Not because I distrust you, because everyone else will. Saren's fingers curled around the spoon. So I become your piece. Tharian stepped closer until the edge of the table was between them, a thin line of wood separating hunger from power. You already were a piece, he said softly. You were simply not mine. Saren's heart hammered. The maid in the corner looked like she wanted to vanish. Saren breathed in, tasting broth, tasting smoke that wasn't there, tasting the iron of old fear. Then she said, carefully, and if I refuse? Tharian's voice went flat. You return to the kitchens, he said. And you will not be called upstairs again. His gaze sharpened. You will be erased quietly this time. The court will call it mercy. Saren's stomach turned. Erasure. It was the truest threat because it wasn't dramatic. It was inevitable. A slow death in steam and shadows, unseen, unremarked. She took another bite of bread, slower than before. She made herself chew. She made herself swallow. And as she ate, something shifted in her posture. Not strength yet. Not fully. But intention. Because she understood, now, that survival wasn't endurance anymore. It was strategy. Saren set the spoon down, hands steady. Tharian watched, waiting, as if the moment mattered. Saren met his gaze. If I accept, she said, I won't pretend it's gratitude. Tharian's eyes narrowed slightly. I have no use for gratitude. Good, Saren said. Her voice steadied, a thin blade of will. Then understand this, I will not be obedient for the sake of your pride. A pulse of tension filled the room. Tharian's expression didn't change, but the air did, like a predator recognizing a spine where it expected collapse. Saren continued, because stopping would be surrender. I will attend when summoned, she said. I will be visible. But I will not perform humiliation to make your factions comfortable. If they want an example, they can look somewhere else. The maid's breath hitched. Tharian stared at Saren for a long moment, and the silence stretched so thin it could snap. Then he said, You are bargaining. Saren's mouth went dry. I'm surviving. Tharian's gaze dropped briefly to her hands, still thin, still marked by scrubbing, but no longer trembling. Then back to her eyes. Very well, he said quietly. Survive. Saren's chest tightened. It wasn't permission. It was acknowledgement. Tharian turned toward the door, his steps unhurried. Before he opened it, he paused and looked back. You will eat, he said. Slowly. Until your body stops shaking. His eyes hardened. And when you can stand without falling, you will stand beside me. Saren's throat tightened again. Beside him. Not behind him. Not beneath. A place that would draw knives from every corner of the court. Tharian opened the door. The corridor's noise leaked in, whispers, footsteps, the distant echo of outrage contained behind etiquette. He stepped out, and the guards straightened like weapons. The door shut. Saren sat in the clean room with the bowl of broth and the bread and the knowledge that nothing here was free. She looked at the food again. Then she ate, not like a starving girl grateful for scraps, but like someone reclaiming what had been stolen and refusing to choke on it. Each swallow was a decision. Each bite was a message. I am still here. Outside, the court shifted, unsettled by what it had witnessed. Factions would form new plans. Old grudges would sharpen. The story they'd used for years, the traitor's daughter kept weak in the dark, had been dragged into the light and rewritten in front of them. And Therian Blackvein had rewritten it with his own hand. Saren wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist, then sat very still, listening to the castle breathe around her. She could feel the eyes even through stone, servants passing, guards pausing, whispers threading down halls like smoke. Fear had replaced mockery. That was not comfort. That was warning. Saren stared at the unlit hearth, at the bed too clean to trust, at the covered tray now uncovered, emptied slowly by her own choice. In the kitchens, invisibility had been a kind of shelter. Now, she had been chosen. And she understood, with a clarity as cold as the stone beneath the linens. Being chosen was not freedom. It was the beginning of negotiation. If this story caught your attention, subscribe so you don't miss the next tale.